Great. Thanks very much for signing up for this series of lectures about economics and its use in policy making. We're very fortunate today. We've got Sama Abdullah with us from the Centre for Wellbeing. He's a senior researcher there, and he wrote briefing number 7, which was about GDP and its shortcomings. Before we get started, this, as all the other briefings, was funded by the Tubney Foundation as part of the Marine Socioeconomics Project, and you all obviously know, because you work for one of the 4 organisations, that MCS, the RSPB, Wildlife Trust and WWF are partners in the project. We're just going to go through the briefing now for about 20 minutes and then talk about the case study. And I just wanted to remind you guys that if you have any questions, there's a chat box in the bottom left of your screen. And if you have any questions, if you just put them into that and send them along, we'll either deal with them as the presentation goes along if they're highly relevant, or deal with them afterwards if that's okay. So you all know how that works. And if you have any questions along the way, obviously just type them in as soon as you have them. So without much further ado, I'll hand you over to Sama, who's going to deal with the big question which concerns us here at NEF on a daily basis, with what's wrong with GDP.
Thank you very much, Chris, and thanks for coming to listen this evening. It's a rainy evening. So today's presentation is going to be about GDP, what's wrong with it, and the alternatives to using GDP. Probably worth just kind of quickly stressing why it's important to look at GDP, why we think it matters, and that's kind of at a very basic level. It's used in so many contexts. It's used to make so many policy decisions, which I'll come on to later. So it's not something that can be set aside and just be considered to be a problem of economics. It's something which affects the whole of society. We've known that there's something wrong with GDP for a long time, and actually from the moment it was created, one of the originators of GDP, Simon Kuznets, already noted that it can scarcely be used to measure welfare. And then this is Robert Kennedy in 1968 who made a very famous and beautiful speech about GDP, where he says things that, for example, that GDP counts for napalm and counts nuclear warheads and armoured cars for the police to fight the riots in our cities, and yet it does not allow for the health of our children, the quality of their education, the joy of their play. And it goes on and mentions many things, and ends. It measures neither our wit nor our courage, neither our wisdom nor our learning, neither our compassion nor our devotion to our country. It measures everything, in short, except that which makes life worthwhile. So we know that there's problems with it, and yet we still use it. Is it like this? Yeah. Okay. And yet we still use it on a day-to-day basis, and perhaps even more so since the economic crisis kicked in 2008. This shows data on the number of newspaper articles. This is sort of like just the general media, which cite GDP and a range of other key indicators. And we just chose, this is just 2 different periods, and this is actually, as I said, before the economic crisis. And you can see that GDP was being referred to very much more often than any of the other indicators. And if you can see, for example, the environmental indicators at the bottom on the right there, CO2 emissions and ecological footprint, are far, far behind. We use it as an indicator for societal progress, not just as an indicator for economic progress. And this is perhaps one of the key issues, that we do think of it as a measure of everything. And you'll see people referring to GDP measuring society or standard of living when it's not meant to be that. And we'll see we can see many different situations where it's being used as a key arbiter for decision making. So voters often will vote and make decisions about who they vote for on the basis of whether they are seen to have, whether the political party has seemed to have increased GDP or not. Businesses will look at GDP forecasts when they determine which countries to put down their roots and invest in. And policymakers are often, almost frequently, sort of when policy decisions are made, as well as considering sort of all the they might consider environmental and social aspects, but at the end of the day, often the bottom line of what's this going to do to GDP trumps any other considerations. So what is GDP? Well, it's quite simply a measure of the value of goods and services produced within a country's borders over a given period of time. And it's basically consumption, so that's how much it's basically how much the country consumes within a period of time, plus investment, plus government spending, which is a little bit, because it's sort of a little bit difficult to fit that into consumption, plus exports minus imports. There are three different ways that GDP is calculated. One is the value added approach. So it's basically if you go through the economy of a country and you go through each stage of that economy, you work out how much value that stage adds to a product, and that's its contribution to GDP. So, for example, a shoemaker who takes bits of leather and converts it into a shoe, his contribution or her contribution to GDP would be the value of the completed shoe, which he or she might sell on to a shop or an online retailer, minus the cost of the bits of leather that went into making that shoe. So it's that's the value added approach. And actually, if you think about how GDP is calculated at regional level in the UK, it's gross value added. It's not exactly the same thing as GDP, but it's calculated using that framework. Another way of thinking about another way that GDP is calculated is the sum of expenditure. So that's the kind of consumption method for calculating GDP. And that's the sum of expenditures on final goods and services by households, firms, and government. So it does not include expenditure on intermediate goods. So, for example, again, that's the expenditure on the shoe by a consumer. So, someone who goes to the shop and buys a pair of shoes, or one shoe, that would be there. That would add to the GDP. That's the expenditure they spend on that pair of shoes. But, for example, the amount of money that the company that makes the shoes sells and spends on leather, for example, does not add to GDP. And the third way that GDP is calculated is to do with income. So that's the sum of incomes generated during economic activities. So that's wages, rental incomes, and corporate profits. Now, theoretically, all those three numbers should actually be the same thing. If you can theoretically, you should be able to calculate GDP in all those three different ways, and it will come to the same number. Of course, things are never as simple as that, and the whole process of national accounts is partly about sort of trying to make sure that those numbers add up and match to a decent extent.
Just doing online presentation.
So that's how GDP is calculated, and as we've seen, the first thing to say is actually those are all at the end of the day, GDP is just a measure of production. It's a measure of the amount of stuff produced. And that's what it was designed to do. And when it was developed during the World War II, the point was that governments wanted to measure how much they were producing. That was the purpose. And in that context, it made a lot of sense. In today's context, it's still, of course, important to measure how much we produce, but it's hard to think of that as a measure of societal progress. Some of the criticisms that have been levied against GDP make that point, that it's not a measure of societal progress, but actually there are some other criticisms which are a bit more technical. The first criticism about GDP is that it measures what's called defensive expenditure. So, and the classic example is it goes up when money is spent, for example, to clean up an oil spill, or it goes up when people buy alarms for houses. These are all things which, of course, they involve spending, they all involve production, they involve services, they involve sort of activity in the market, and yet it's hard to think of them as being things which contribute to the society. In the end of the day, if we didn't have to clean up the oil spill, then we'd be better off. And so that's what's called the defensive expenditure. Second thing is that GDP relies on market prices to value things. So the value that is attached to any product is basically how much people spend on them. So a meal in a Michelin restaurant, which costs whatever £1,000, is seen to contribute to welfare 100 times more, or let's say 200 times more than meals that cost £5, or 1,000 times more than a meal that costs £1. There's a couple of assumptions made in that. The second of which I'll come to in a bit. But the first one is that basically the price is right. The price is actually the value of a good. And as you'll hear on Monday, if you come to the next briefing, briefing 8, when James Medway will be talking about how market values come to be, that's obviously quite a sharp assumption to make. And of course, it also doesn't value anything that's where the markets are not the main way to deliver an outcome. So the picture in the background there is of a maternity ward in the UK. Obviously, we don't have to pay for our health services, and so the way that health services are valued in the GDP is not based on the value that people would pay, how much people would pay for maternity services, because obviously they don't have to pay for them. So it's based on how much government spends on those services rather than actually the value they contribute. But that's underestimating their value. In the same way that we'd be underestimating GDP if we just valued companies based on their inputs, not on their profits. An even more extreme case, of course, is that we don't include in the GDP any household services or volunteering. So if someone cleans their house, that doesn't count to GDP. But if someone goes and pays a domestic labourer to clean their house, that adds to GDP. So again, it's there's a bias towards things which are produced in the market. And as I said, with the example about the Michelin meal versus 1,000 meals at home, which cost £1, for example, GDP ignores issues of distribution. So it assumes that £10 which add to the income of Bill Gates or any other millionaire is the same as £10 which is added to the income of someone who's on the minimum wage. Now, economists know that that's not the case. I mean, one of the basic premises of economics is the idea of the law of diminishing returns, the idea that any added amount of income, the value of that for someone's welfare depends on the income they start with. So the idea of diminishing returns is based on a logarithmic relationship, which I can explain if people want me to explain after the presentation. But simply put, the idea is that if you double your income, that's meant to imply a similar increase in welfare wherever you are on the income distribution. So if you double your income from 100 to £200 a month, that's equivalent in terms of welfare gains as if you double your income from 100,000 to 200,000. Now, GDP doesn't take that into account, and so it's already sort of failing to capture one of the basic premises of economics. Now, all those three criticisms, that it doesn't count defensive expenditures, that it values things at market, is only able to value things at market prices, and that it ignores distribution, are all things that economists are aware of, and economists, and even sort of fairly classical economists are aware of, and fairly classical economists are trying to deal with. And there are sort of various and there are ways to deal with that using economic tools. But there are a couple of other criticisms which are a bit harder to tackle within the economics paradigm. The fourth one, of course, is the environmental issue, the issue of sustainability, of futurity. The fact is that GDP. So GDP does not have any measure of, but it does not capture what we do to our natural capital stocks, and it doesn't capture what we do in terms of environmental damage. Now, this wouldn't be a problem if, of course, well, it wouldn't be such a problem if, of course, it wasn't the case that GDP almost directly correlates with our environmental impact. If you look at, for example, a graph of GDP and ecological footprint by nation, there's almost a straight correlation. So countries which have bigger ecological footprints tend to have much bigger GDPs. And so there's quite a strong sort of default to more GDP meaning more environmental damage. Now, of course, we can try and capture, and I think Chris will try and tackle some of this in when he starts talking about the case study. We can start talking about sort of capital stocks, natural capital stocks, and we can start talking about ecosystem services and valuing those, and that can be brought into GDP. But of course, it starts to get a bit more challenging because we start having to deal with things like discounting, and we start having to deal with a lot of uncertainty. We don't know exactly how much we should value the damage to our ecosystems in terms of future impact to human welfare. So it becomes a little bit more tricky to bring that into a GDP metric. And the last thing is that, and this is actually kind of, I think in a way, a sort of a much broader point. So fundamentally, if we treat GDP as a measure of progress, we're implying that the more we consume, and even if we make all those adjustments, even if we adjust for defensive expenditure, we adjust for market prices, we adjust for inequality, and we try and find some way of capturing the negative impacts on our natural capital, all that adjustments would still make the assumption that basically the more we consume in the market, the better. And obviously, that's built on a quite strong premise that the way to improving people's well-being is to consume in the market. And we know that obviously consumption is good. We all need to consume a certain amount of products, but that's missing out a big part of the human experience. So, what alternatives have been put out there? And I'll just quickly sort of flash through some of the alternatives that have been put out there to GDP. So the first approach is to make adjustments, and this is sort of dealing with particularly the first 3 or 4 of those criticisms that I mentioned just now. So you take GDP and then you make various adjustments to it. So one example of this, a classical example of this, is the Index of Sustainable Economic Wellbeing, which the New Economics Foundation brought to the UK and has worked on for a long time. Not very much at the moment, but it's still in our repertoire as such. And this basically takes consumer expenditure, makes an adjustment for income inequality, tries to incorporate public expenditures, so it tries to capture some of those non-market goods, that adds value for domestic labour and volunteering, removes defensive expenditures, removes the cost of environmental degradation, and removes the depreciation of natural capital. And when you make all those adjustments, you get a number which you can see if you look at these 2 lines in the graph. We used to call it the MDP, which is a measure of domestic progress, but it's the same thing as the Index of Sustainable Economic Wellbeing. And you can see that whilst GDP was romping away, rising between 1950 and the early part of this millennium, the MDP stayed at a fairly low rate. And when we produced this in 2004, the headlines were that the best year in the UK was 1976, when Starsky and Hutch was on television. Another approach is to go back to that. So as I say, that adjustments approach deals with 4 of those criticisms, but it doesn't really bring in that issue of sort of, well, it still makes the assumption that more consumption is better. And to be honest, a lot of the adjustments that are made when you calculate the ICW are a little bit, I mean, we still have to use market prices in a lot of cases, and it's quite a it's a very sensitive methodology. If you make slightly different adjustments, you make slightly different assumptions, the results come out very differently. So that's one of the reasons why we've shied away from using the Index of Sustainable Economic Wellbeing at the moment. But other countries, for example, Germany is exploring it quite a bit at the moment, and the USA, the state of Maryland is looking at it quite a bit as well. Another approach is to create a dashboard of indicators. So that's basically to say, okay, well, GDP is important, but it's not the only thing, so let's measure lots of other things. And that's the approach which a lot of countries in in Europe are taking at the moment, and a lot of sort of official bodies. So the picture in the middle of the screen there is the ONS's wheel of measures of national well-being, and they've sort of identified about 40 indicators there to measure national well-being, and you can look through each of them. Other similar approaches are the OECD Better Life Initiative. Eurostat doing something similar, and in Italy there's a quite similar sort of official initiative. That's great because it highlights there's lots of things you have to think about when you're measuring progress. But the problem with this approach is it doesn't really give you a clear answer. Sort of what actually. So you look at that wheel and you can see some things have gone up and some things have gone down. But what does it mean overall? It's hard to get a full picture. And therefore, the risk is just to go, okay, well, let's just see what GDP is doing, because it's much easier to understand. That's why a lot of people have started developing composite indicators, which are often based on something like this, often based on this sort of set of different indicators, but then they try to bring them together into a single headline composite indicator. One of the first examples of this is the Canadian Index of Wellbeing, which is in the bottom right of the screen there, which has 8 different domains and 8 indicators within each domain, and it brings them all together to a single Canadian Index of Wellbeing. But another example of that is the Oxfam Humankind Index, which Oxfam Scotland developed, and we helped them put that together. And in both those cases, the people who developed them recognize that if you have a dashboard, it's very hard to get any attention on the indicator, and that you need an overall message, and that's why they've gone for these kind of index approaches. It's worth noting in both these cases they're both non-official bodies doing these indicators, so they need to kind of draw attention to the indicators. But actually, to be honest, often these sort of composite indicators, headline indicators, even when they're not official, have had more media coverage than some of the official initiatives out there. And then the last approach is to use subjective well-being in your measure of progress. And the idea of this is that basically, if you take a sort of, a lot of these sort of the last two approaches where you have a big list of domains of things that are important are basically a list of domains that experts have sat together and decided are important to people's well-being. So they've thought, okay, well, we think health is important, we think education is important, we think housing is important, and they've made a list of different things that are important, they've made a list of indicators which are important, and they've decided that's what should go into an index. In the case of the Oxfam Humankind Index, they did what I think is the right thing, is then to ask people how important each of those things are. But often that doesn't happen. It's just sort of entirely expert-led, and the number that they come up with is somehow meant to sum up the overall sort of what's important to people. Now, the subjective well-being approach basically says, well, we don't need to go through all that, because actually, if you just ask people how they're feeling, they will make all those calculations in their head themselves. So if you ask someone how satisfied they are with their lives, they will think about explicitly or implicitly the things that are important to them, their health, their education, their job, their relationships, and they'll weight them in their head implicitly or explicitly and come up with a number. So someone whose life, their work life is going very well, but their relationship isn't going so well, they'll weight those two things out and come out with a 6 out of 10 or whatever. But if, for example, their work is really, really important, their relationship's not important to them, then it doesn't matter that their relationship's not working. So in a way, it allows people to decide what's important to them when they answer these questions. So the Happy Planet Index is one approach which has used the subjective well-being, and that's brought together people's subjective well-being, so their experience well-being, how they feel their life is going, brings it together with their health, partly because we feel that often people, you ask someone how they feel now, but actually they may not well be thinking about, someone might, such as myself, I smoke, probably makes me feel happier, but it's not good for my life expectancy. So you need to capture some of the life expectancy in there, because it's part of the futurity thing, which people aren't able to manage by themselves. They're not able to discount that, I guess. And then the other thing, of course, is the environmental impact, because a few environmentalists aside, most people's well-being isn't harmed by the fact that isn't harmed by their concerns about what's going to happen to the planet in 20 or 50 years' time. So we have to bring that in explicitly. We have to bring that in with objective data, and that's why we bring the ecological footprint in there. So the Happy Planet Index basically takes experience well-being now, multiplies it by life expectancy, creates something called happy life years, and then divides that by ecological footprint. And that calculates the sort of efficiency of achieving well-being within a country, ecological efficiency of achieving well-being within a country. The nice thing about that is it brings out, by doing it like that, we don't have to combine too many numbers, and it brings out something which we believe covers a whole range of things which are covered in those other types of initiative which I mentioned earlier. So we know that education will impact on people's subjective well-being, we know that their housing will, we know that their income will, we know that their relationships will, all those things which other initiatives have to measure and include separately, we know will in fact influence people's experience well-being. And the important thing, the idea behind this, is it gives you a headline measure which captures the attention of the public and the media. So, oh, someone else has joined. So with that, that I think wraps up what I was going to say. So those, just to quickly to summarise, those are 5 key criticisms. So I'll go back to that page. 5 key criticisms of GDP, and then 4 different alternative approaches to going beyond GDP. And I sort of put those 4 out as alternatives, but of course, actually, they can be combined. So we advocate, for example, approaches which produce a single headline indicator, but also allow you to decompose it into different domains. So the dashboard of indicators is still behind that, because of course, as a policymaker, you would need to be able to measure how society is going overall, and that's key for the overall message. But then you need to be able to measure other things to know what you can do about it and what the problems are. Shall I stop there? And that's brilliant.
Great, thanks very much. Remember, if there's any questions, you may as well start typing them now, but a few things actually sprung to mind while I was listening to that. The first one is obviously that we hear so much banded around in the media about growth, and it's important to explicitly state that what that really is growth in GDP. So something that would, measure the amount of antidepressants produced and consumed in this country as a positive is the overriding objective of any kind of government policy. We've heard, you know, the environment is a barrier to growth and all these kind of statements coming from George Osborne and others. And I think this is a really, really major issue, and it's something that we've been grappling with for a number of years. And I think it's coming to prominence now, because the real question is growth in what? Why are we aiming for that particular kind of growth when there's so much, you know, if it comes at the expense of inequality or if it comes at the expense of the environment, is that really the best thing to pursue? And the Happy Planet Index was downloaded well over 1 million times, wasn't it, over the time? So it's something that throughout the world people are taking this seriously. Bhutan has started measuring, not that that's the most important country on earth, but it still started measuring an alternative, you know, which focuses on the well-being of the population rather than just on financial transactions. The other thing it made me think about is, for example, the beach cleans that are done by volunteers that the Marine Conservation Society organises. That is undoubtedly hugely valuable to anyone that uses the beach for whatever different reason, and it obviously won't show up at all as a contribution to GDP, so it might be something interesting to look into. If you were going to pay people minimum wage to clean litter off the beach, you know, how many jobs would that provide, and what would that do for GDP? It might be an interesting angle to go down. But in terms of the case study, rather than read through lots of different numbers, which will be confusing for a video, it's probably more useful if you read through the case study in detail yourselves. But what it really deals with is 3 aspects. One, breaking down all the industries and sectors that use the marine environment, and looks at them in terms of value-added GDP and employment. And the things that really stand out are that the main, as you'll see on the table, the main sort of valuable activities that we get from the sea are oil and gas, and marine engineering, and ports and shipping. When you look at those things in aggregate extraction, they don't actually rely on the sea being in particularly good shape. You can dig for sand and gravel if there's not a single fish left. You can prospect for oil if there's no fish left and all the marine habitats are destroyed. It's really quite irrelevant. When you look at the things like leisure and recreation and fisheries and education, which obviously require habitats and species to be in some form of better shape, they don't contribute that much to GDP, but they are still notable. Leisure and recreation, nearly 4% of the UK's GDP, which is nearly 4 times more than what we get from capture fisheries, which I was recently looking at. It was 0.07% contribution to GDP. I can see a lot of people have joined us quite late. A recording for this presentation will be sent round as soon as we finish, within about half an hour, and I'd really encourage you and also your colleagues to watch the recordings. And thanks, before I go into the case study any further, thanks Jill for saying that you're going to look into the beach cleaning activities. I think that's very valuable. So, in terms of the main uses of the sea and their contribution to GDP, you can see that the main activity is those that involve extraction. Often these are or pretty much always, these are of non-renewable resources. So at some point, following that trajectory of getting as much out of the sea as you can, at some point that's going to come up against environmental limits and there won't be anything left. So in that long-term approach, it's clearly fairly illogical to just focus on growth from the sea when these resources are finite. The other thing was a kind of like a thought experiment or a way of visualizing this when it comes to fisheries. If you imagine, take a fishery, take one of the ones in your local area that you might work with, and just imagine that over time stocks decrease, and due to overfishing the fish stocks become overexploited. If no management or regulations are brought in, then the stock collapses, the fishery is then closed. Along the way, obviously, it's made as much money as it could quickly due to overfishing and overcapacity, so GDP has gone up. Now that the stock is completely overexploited and the fishery is closed, all the fishermen who made a living from that stock now have no jobs and they need to be compensated. That, of course, is government spending. So if they go on benefits or if they get paid to scrap their vessels or anything else or any other form of subsidy, that also comes up in GDP. And this really sort of paints a picture of the kind of trajectory that you can be supporting if your only target is GDP growth. Something as perverse as that actually ends up looking like a positive. Other than that, we have some work that we did in our recent report, which was No Catch Investment, and I'd urge you guys to look at that, which basically compares what a healthy fish stock, or what healthy fish stocks can do versus overfished fish stocks in terms of jobs, employment and contribution to GDP. That's a whole presentation in itself. If you're interested, I can send you the links to that. The final part of this presentation was really about where DEFRA's thinking is in all of this. And I'd like to read you word for word something from a DEFRA paper which is quoted. It starts with the bit on your screen about TEED, the economics of ecosystems and biodiversity, and the national ecosystem assessment, but also knowledge on well-being, which Sama talked about at the end of his presentation. But it also says economic valuation techniques are now well established and have an essential role to play for incorporating the value of marginal changes in environmental quality or ecosystem services and social cost-benefit analysis, which you'll remember from the first presentation. However, and the fourth. However, too often when valuation is not applied to them, the implicit value attributed to social or environmental impact is zero. In some cases, monetary valuation alone cannot provide a meaningful or complete picture of the cost or benefit of a given policy change, and the use of non-monetary evidence may be more appropriate. For example, there are limits in understanding of the links between biodiversity and the ecosystem service it provides, as well as limits to our capacity to value biodiversity as a service in itself. Now, I think this is important to note because we often spend a lot of time sort of trying to lobby DEFRA, but this really points out that the level of understanding of the DEFRA is very high. They have a lot of very skilled economists who are actually working there. They're very aware of these problems and are working on solutions to it. But higher up the kind of government food chain, if you like, we have the Treasury, and we have bodies which are responsible for telling people how to evaluate public spending and how to evaluate whether their policy is going to be a good or bad thing. And that takes us back to this kind of cost-benefit analysis kind of approach as not being fit for a lot of social and environmental decision-making. So what should we use in its place? I think the most useful way of looking at this is to continue with the sort of analogy to fishing. And there was a link to work which was done for DEFRA by Vivid Economics about national fisheries accounts. And this is also a methodology which can be tested, and it tells you a lot more about what's actually important in this sense, which is the fish stocks and about the sustainability of using that resource. So first of all, fishery accounts need to look at the biology. So the stock at the start and the end of the year of a fishery, that would be your natural capital in its most basic sense. What is the sort of breeding biomass of fish at the beginning of the year, and what have you exploited towards the end? Then you can also look at the economic accounts on the value of the stock. I've got a paper here from the MMO which said that the value of UK landings in 2012 was 627,000 tonnes of sea fish worth £770 million. For example, you could bring that into it. But then, of course, the issue of discounting the future, which came up in presentation 5, also needs to be taken on board, because obviously a fish stock is worth the same to 5 generations down the line as it is to us today, possibly even more so. Then you obviously have to look at the externalities. What about climate change as a result of using fossil fuels? What about the externality on other fishermen by certain fishermen overfishing? And what about the externality of damage to the habitat that many fish species will rely on some aspect of the habitat they live in for survival? So we have to measure these externalities and bring them in and subtract them from those fisheries accounts. And the dashboards that Sama talked about before are a good way of doing this kind of thing, where you're looking at lots of different indicators and turning them into a composite, I suppose, would also be an option. But it's definitely something that has been tried and tested. There's research which has been done for the government, and it's something I would urge you to read. Other than that, there's also been sort of sets of indicators which have been discussed by DEFRA, which look at the value created or destroyed by good or by bad management. That's also something NEF looked at, with the value slipping through the net research. And also looking at the economic health of the fleet. That's also something that needs to be borne in mind, and the cost to the public purse. What happens if you have to subsidise massively? What happens if you have to bail out fishermen who can no longer work because there's not enough fish stocks left to guarantee them a job? So I'd urge you to look at the case studies. If you have any comments or questions about it, please obviously get in touch. We're always happy to hear about it. And I don't know, I can see you writing something down. Did you want to add anything, Simon?
No, not at this stage. I think we'll wait for questions and see.
Excellent. Are there any questions about what you guys have heard? For those who came later on in the presentation, there's a chat box in the bottom left of the screen. If you've got any questions, we'd be really happy to answer them.
Actually, it might be worth saying. I mean, just sort of to link the two parts of the presentation together. One of the sometimes a lot of our work at NEF in the Centre for Wellbeing is purely about wellbeing. We don't always have Planet Index includes an environmental angle, but a lot of our work doesn't include environmental angle explicitly. And sometimes we sometimes people ask us, why haven't you included the environment? Why aren't you doing more stuff on environmental indicators? We need to, if we're going to move beyond GDP, we need to incorporate environmental indicators in there. And I think that one of our approaches is to say, one of the reasons why we focus on well-being is it's partly about a recognition that GDP is measuring something that people want to maximize. It's about something about what people want. It's about short-term interests. And so if you incorporate sort of environmental indicators in there, it's already sort of it's a different beast. I mean, the public doesn't get excited about reducing environmental impact in the same way as they do about increasing, the expectation that their living standards are going to increase. So the idea about well-being is that it is something that people want to maximize. It's still something that people want to increase. But increasing well-being doesn't inevitably mean a negative impact on the environment. And maybe I should have brought this graph into the presentation, but I think I mentioned earlier the relationship between GDP and environment and ecological footprint being almost like a straight line. If you look at well-being, experienced well-being, or even sort of experienced well-being combined with life expectancy and ecological footprint, you'll see that it's not straight line. Actually, there's kind of the relationship is much more diffuse. There are countries that have relatively high levels of life expectancy, relatively high levels of experienced well-being without having high footprints. So by focusing on well-being, it points to, it reduces the tension between what we're trying to maximize and what we're trying to reduce. So at the moment, what we're trying to maximize is GDP, and what we're trying to reduce environmental impact. People talk about green growth. That's a very hard tension to tackle. But green well-being, where you're maximizing well-being but and reducing environmental impact, looks like a much easier prospect. So that's one of the reasons why we might sometimes not talk about environmental impact directly, because we feel that the well-being somehow manages to avoid some of those trade-offs.
Thank you.
Were there any questions?
No, it doesn't look like there were. I'll circulate the links to the report, but if there's no questions now, then I'll just stop the recording. No, looks like that was all very clear. Maybe on a final note, to paraphrase Andrew Sims, GDP would be happiest if I'm stuck in traffic in my car waiting to buy a weed killer at B&Q rather than taking a stroll down to my local beach. We'll leave it at that.